Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. Islamic history is filled with inspirational figures who we can all look up to and learn from to be model citizens in our lives today. Normally, though, when we think of history and inspirational figures, we think of prophets and the male companions around the prophet. But what about the women? Those who are mentioned in the Quran and whom every man and woman can learn valuable lessons from. Well, we're about to embark on a series on remarkable women in Islamic history. Today we'll cover the lives of two empowering women, Hawa, the first woman on earth, and Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh. Joining me is Dr. Shabir Ali to discuss the lives of these women. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So let's start with Hawa, so the first woman on earth. Who was she and how was she created?
Well, the Quran, interestingly, talks about the creation of Adam and Eve. And the way in which this is mentioned in the Quran is slightly different from the way it is mentioned in the Bible. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it says that God created Adam and then brought all of the animals to Adam to see in what he might find satisfaction. But he could find satisfaction in none of these things until God eventually created for him a mate. And then it goes into detail by saying that God put Adam to sleep and made Eve from one of his ribs. And then he was able to say, this is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. And the lesson is obviously that men and women are close to each other and beloved to each other. Eve would be close to Adam's heart, and together they will be one flesh, but they're already originally, in a way, one flesh. Beautiful story. The Quran, on the other hand, has a different take on this, in that the Quran says that God created us from a single soul. We know from the 4th chapter of the Quran, the first verse, be mindful of God who created you from a single soul, and then from that single soul made you into men and women. The 7th chapter of the Quran speaks of God again creating you from a single soul, and then from that soul its mate. And then when he covered her, she bore a light weight which she was able to travel with. So this speaks about conception. But the sequence in which things are mentioned here gives the impression that the single soul was actually the female soul. And then God, from that female, created the male as well. A usual commentary on this is to say that it doesn't mean like one person. It means like the same kind. God created you all from the same kind. So there's something that we don't quite fully grasp here, but the impression given is as if Eve is the original soul, and from that original feminine soul, the male was also created, and then when he covered her, she conceived, and then the human progeny began to flow from there.
This might be obvious, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit. Is there any significance in understanding the role of women in Islam, given the limited information that we know about Eve?
Yes, often the story of Adam and Eve is told from the point of view of Adam. And this is both in the Bible and in the Quran. Eve takes a kind of a secondary place. But what is interesting is that the Quran revises the picture a bit in this regard as well, in that the Quran says that God created them and placed them in the garden, and then Satan whispered to them and caused them to slip from the state of happiness in which they were. That's in the 2nd chapter of the Quran. In the 7th chapter, again, we have a similar depiction that it is the two of them involved, and Satan caused them to remove their clothing. Satan is like misleading and whispering to them. This is in contrast with the biblical narrative where in the book of Genesis we have it that Satan came to the woman and said to her, is it true that God said that you are not to eat from this one particular tree? And then he convinces her to eat from that tree. She eats from it, and then she gives the fruit also to her husband, and then he ate. So some people were able to make a point based on this, that Eve is like the gateway to Adam, and the devil did not approach Adam directly, but went through the woman. And this begins a series of narratives in the Old Testament where women often are depicted as temptresses or seductresses or so on. In the Quranic narrative, we have this situation slightly reversed in that we have Adam on several occasions and Eve together being spoken of as being the objects of Satan's guile. And in one particular passage in the 20th chapter of the Quran, in the 120th verse, and in that area, it is said that Adam disobeyed his Lord. So specifically Adam, but in the other narratives there is no specific mention that Eve disobeyed. Not she specifically, it's the two of them. So with this in mind, we see that even with the limited knowledge we have of Eve in the Quranic narrative, we still have a different way of looking at her contribution to human society and the place of women more generally in human society. Women are not to be seen as seductresses or temptresses or the source of the fall of man or the cause of the fall of man. Women are there as the Bible says, actually, as man's helpmate. But more than this, they are on equal footing as servants of God. And with or without men, women should be and can be servants of God.
That's very beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
So let's now move into the story of Asiya. So can you tell us a little bit about who she was and what we know about her?
Asiya is given in the Quran as the wife of the Pharaoh, who had interactions with the prophet Moses. It is mentioned in the story of Moses that when his mother placed him in the floating device, the vessel, and placed him upon the Nile River, the vessel took him all the way to the court of the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's wife then took up this baby and said, let's not kill the baby, but let's keep him. Maybe we can adopt him and he can be of some benefit to us, and he will be a child to us. So her compassion, which is known of women more generally, is pronounced in the Quran, and her care for what would be a prophet and messenger of God, one of the most important prophets in human history, is therefore registered in the Quranic text. And this is interesting because she came from a background which was foreign to the perspective of God's people in this particular narrative. And normally narratives tend to sideline other people and paint them in the darkest pictures possible. But here the Quran is showing that Asiya was not only a remarkable woman, but despite the fact that she came from the other side, she is nonetheless a devout servant of God.
So just building on that point, given that she was the wife of Pharaoh, did that impact her relationship with God, and how did that work out?
Of course, an impact could be both positive and negative. In this case, we see that from the 66th chapter of the Quran in the 11th verse, Asiya is painted as an example of a true believer. So the Quran is saying, in essence, if you want to know what a true believer is like, look at Asiya. And the Quran says that she said in her prayer, my Lord, build for me in your presence a house in paradise, and rescue me from the Pharaoh and from the oppressive people. So she was in the midst of oppressive people, but she didn't want to be one of them.
And in addition to her husband being Pharaoh, so that further complicated things a little bit.
Exactly, and that shows that a woman may have an oppressive husband, but she can be her own person, and she can decide what is right, and she can do and follow what is right.
So just wrapping this up, what can we take from, if there's one takeaway lesson that you would want our viewers to take about Eve and Asiya, what would that one takeaway message be?
Well, in both cases, we see that the Quran depicts these women as independently persons of their own, servants of God, who can decide what is right and do what is right. And that is a lesson for all of us today, for both men and women. In the case of Asiya, living in the midst of oppression, but deciding to do what is right and not to follow the oppressive forces, and not to allow herself to be dominated by the oppression around her. This all gives us hope today that we ourselves, with the help of God, can hold our own ground and stand up for truth and justice.
I know I feel very empowered, so thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.